I'm a 52-year-old man, and for most of my life, I believed that patience was a virtue, that calmness, responsibility, and silent endurance were traits that would eventually earn respect, fairness, and recognition in a family where love often felt conditional and fairness was a scarce commodity. I thought that being polite, doing my chores without complaint, paying my bills on time, and handling my responsibilities without drama would naturally make me worthy of consideration, but my experiences proved otherwise, because in my family, it was never about merit, effort, or consistency. It was about favoritism, charm, and who could manipulate the narrative the best. And unfortunately for me, that had always been my younger sister, Sarah, the golden child in my mother's eyes, the one who could break every rule, shirk every responsibility, and still walk through life as though the universe owed her gratitude, while I, who had painstakingly built my own life from scratch, was constantly reminded of my supposed shortcomings, as if every decision I made, every sacrifice I endured, every late night spent working to create stability and security were invisible, inconsequential, and insufficient to earn love or approval. I remember the day Sarah moved back into the house I had bought with every ounce of my energy, every paycheck sacrificed, every loan repaid with blood, sweat, and tears, and how she walked in with her suitcase, smiling as though she owned the place, tossing her keys onto the counter, and declaring casually that she wouldn't need to pay rent because, of course, Mom had decided she deserved to live there rent-free, as though the years I had poured into acquiring the property, the months of scrimping and saving to keep it afloat, the legal paperwork, the painstaking maintenance, and the very foundation of the house itself were irrelevant, because Sarah's convenience outweighed any notion of fairness or justice. I tried to speak up, to explain the absurdity of the situation, the financial strain, and the unfairness of prioritizing a grown adult who had repeatedly demonstrated irresponsibility over the son who had faithfully contributed and labored to secure a future. But Mom, ever the voice of moral superiority and selective affection, dismissed my concerns with that familiar, condescending smile that always made me feel smaller than I was, and said those words I had heard my entire adult life: be the bigger person, as though I were some petulant child throwing a tantrum instead of a man calmly asserting his rights. And I remember feeling a sharp surge of anger, frustration, and disbelief, and yet, instead of reacting impulsively, I smiled politely, nodded, and said nothing, because by then, I had learned the value of observation, of watching and listening, of quietly cataloging every slight, every injustice, every word, and every action, storing them all like pieces of a puzzle I would one day complete, understanding that patience is often misunderstood as weakness and quietness as submission, when in reality, they are the calm before a storm, the preparatory steps of someone who refuses to be blindsided by circumstance, someone who notices everything while everyone else assumes he is harmless, unnoticed, or incapable of action. And so, I waited, bided my time, and meticulously prepared for the day when the scales of imbalance would finally tilt back toward justice, because the house, the account statements, the keys, the utilities, and the legal powers that had been assumed as permanent advantages by my sister were all details that could be leveraged if I only acted with precision, strategy, and quiet decisiveness. And I had, for years, made certain that every document, every bank record, every utility account, every email thread was carefully organized, filed, and accessible, knowing that one day, the moment would arise when the silent, underestimated man could shift the dynamic entirely. And that morning finally came, the day I would step into my rightful power without confrontation, drama, or emotional volatility. A morning that began like any other with coffee brewing, the sunlight filtering lazily through the kitchen blinds, and Sarah sprawled on the couch, scrolling endlessly through her phone, oblivious to the storm about to descend upon her entitled world. I moved calmly, with deliberate intent, retrieving the keys that had always belonged to me, changing the locks without hesitation, and securing control over every entry point, while inside, a quiet thrill built like a secret pulse, the satisfaction of knowing that the physical barrier was merely the first act in a series of carefully orchestrated steps. I contacted the bank with one precise, concise email, asserting control over accounts and transactions, making certain that every financial lever was firmly in my hands, while simultaneously contacting utility providers, placing holds on services that had long been taken for granted by those who assumed ownership without effort, and watching as the pieces aligned seamlessly for the moment that would redefine our household hierarchy. I didn't need to announce my actions, to raise my voice, to dramatize my control, because the impact would speak for itself, and within hours, it began, phones ringing incessantly with missed calls, texts pouring in like waves of disbelief and panic, frantic messages from Sarah and Mom as they realized, with growing horror, that the quiet, polite, patient man they had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated had orchestrated a flawless reclamation of authority, and their world, built on assumptions of my passivity, was crumbling in real time, the chaos a testament not to malice but to meticulous planning and unwavering resolve. I watched them scramble, their voices rising in the living room, a chaotic symphony of panic, entitlement, and desperation, Sarah pacing, crying, pleading, and screaming, while Mom alternated between attempts to manipulate with guilt and futile commands to be reasonable, and I sat calmly, coffee in hand, noting the irony, the poetic justice, the beauty of controlled, patient action finally coming to fruition, understanding in that moment that respect is not given, it is earned, and often earned most powerfully through preparation, precision, and the ability to act decisively when everyone else assumes you are harmless. I reflected then, quietly, on the years of being overlooked. The subtle manipulation, the constant comparisons to Sarah, the endless reminders of my supposed inadequacy, and realized that none of it had been wasted, because every slight, every word, every dismissive glance had been catalogued, stored, and would now serve as the foundation of a new dynamic in which my patience and quiet observation proved stronger than the loud demands, entitlement, and favoritism I had endured for decades. I observed the turning point, the subtle shift in body language. The frantic texts, the escalating phone calls, the confused attempts at persuasion and emotional manipulation, all evidence that the underestimated quiet man had become the decisive force, the orchestrator of a calm but undeniable upheaval. And I realized that the satisfaction did not come from humiliation or revenge but from the restoration of balance, fairness, and personal boundaries, the quiet affirmation that years of patience, observation, and preparation could outweigh arrogance, entitlement, and favoritism. And as the hours passed, the reality set in for both Sarah and Mom that their assumptions about me had been disastrously incorrect, that underestimating someone who seemed quiet and compliant had consequences far beyond anything they had anticipated, and that a patient, strategic mind, armed with careful preparation and calm decisiveness, could shift entire dynamics without raising a single voice. And in that moment, I understood that my role in this family, once dismissed and minimized, had been quietly recalibrated, respect established, boundaries reinforced, and lessons in humility imparted in the most effective, deliberate way possible. And as the dust settled, and the calls slowed, and the frantic messages subsided into grudging acknowledgement, I reflected on the profound lesson that life teaches when patience is paired with action, that true strength is often hidden behind a serene exterior, that calm, methodical, intelligent intervention can speak far louder than anger or loud confrontation, and that sometimes, the quiet one is not just observing but preparing, not just tolerating but calculating, not just patient but inevitable in their impact. And I felt a quiet pride, the deep, unshakable knowledge that I had acted with dignity, precision, and fairness, that the house I had built, the accounts I had managed, the legal control I had maintained were finally aligned with the respect and acknowledgement I had earned, and that the silent observer, long underestimated, had not only restored balance but had revealed, definitively, the power of patience, quiet intelligence, and measured action, a lesson I carry still and hope anyone watching understands. Never mistake silence for weakness, patience for submission, or calm observation for incapacity, because sometimes, the quiet man taking notes is the one who ultimately changes everything, and in the end, the measure of a person is not in the volume of their voice, but in the precision, integrity, and resolve of their actions when the time to act finally comes. And I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the storm I had quietly prepared for years had arrived and departed with grace, dignity, and a quiet but undeniable authority, and that I, the quiet man who had been underestimated, had finally shown that patience, preparation, and strategic action are far more powerful than entitlement, favoritism, or impulsive arrogance. Looking back on everything that had unfolded over those intense, chaotic days, I realized with a clarity that came only from distance and reflection that the real conflict had never been about a house, about utilities, or about money. It had been about respect, fairness, and boundaries, those invisible yet unshakable forces that shape the dynamics of families, relationships, and human interaction. And for decades, I had quietly navigated a household where love seemed conditional, where recognition was allocated selectively, and where the virtue of patience, politeness, and consistent effort was measured not by outcomes but by attention, by affection, and by approval that seemed forever reserved for Sarah, my sister, whose charm, her effortless ability to manipulate situations in her favor, and her mother's unwavering favoritism had created a dynamic where my achievements, my labor, and my integrity were repeatedly overshadowed, dismissed, and undervalued, leaving me with a growing awareness that fairness was not simply going to be handed to me, that respect could not be demanded politely when others refused to see it, and that boundaries, if unasserted, were trampled by entitlement, ignorance, and assumption. And in those moments of reflection, I recognized that my years of patience and silence had not been wasted, that every observation, every note, every careful record of habits, patterns, and tendencies had built a foundation upon which I could act decisively when the time was right, and that the calm, methodical approach I had taken to reclaim control was not born of anger or vengeance, but of principle, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. And as I considered the process, the meticulous preparation of documents, bank accounts, keys, utilities, passwords, and legal measures, all undertaken without a hint of threat, confrontation, or intimidation, I understood that the power of quiet observation and patient planning is profound. Invisible to those blinded by arrogance, entitlement, or assumption, yet unstoppable when unleashed with precision and timing. And I thought about Mom, who had always lectured about patience, forgiveness, and being that bigger person, and how, in her desire to mold perception and assert control, she had underestimated not only me but the principle that consistent, patient action backed by careful preparation outweighs moral lectures when reality must be confronted. And I reflected on Sarah, whose sense of entitlement, casual arrogance, and assumption that the house, the utilities, and the privileges she had enjoyed were permanent, had led her to believe that she could manipulate, demand, and disregard boundaries without consequence. And watching her reaction, her panic, her eventual hesitant compliance, and the subtle shift in her behavior, I realized that the lessons she absorbed, though not immediate, were lasting, grounded in the undeniable consequences of underestimating someone who listens, watches, and waits. And I understood fully that this was a lesson I had been unconsciously preparing to teach for years, not through confrontation, but through the assertion of rightful control when all conditions aligned perfectly. And I considered the profound insight that patience alone is rarely enough. Life rewards not just endurance or restraint, but preparedness, action, self-respect, and the courage to reclaim what is rightfully yours when the moment demands it. And in this context, reclaiming control of the household was never about revenge. It was about asserting dignity, establishing boundaries, and demonstrating that fairness must be respected if relationships, family dynamics, and social trust are to survive. And as I moved through my home, now fully in control, I reflected on the invisible power shift that had taken place, how my quiet demeanor, often mistaken for weakness or passivity, had concealed a depth of strategy, observation, and anticipation that had now revealed itself in the most profound way possible. And in that quiet control, I found a sense of liberation and clarity that came from knowing that assumptions of weakness are costly, that those who rely solely on charm, favoritism, or manipulation are vulnerable to consequences when faced with someone who observes carefully, calculates precisely, and acts decisively. And I realized that my identity in the household had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the passive, polite, unappreciated son, the one whose efforts went unnoticed, whose labor was overshadowed, and whose quiet voice was ignored. I had become the quiet man who takes notes, who observes patiently, who accumulates knowledge and leverage over time, and who, when the moment is right, executes with precision and unassailable authority. And as I reflected further, I appreciated the broader lesson for life itself. Beyond family dynamics, that calmness, patience, and strategic observation are far more powerful than anger, loud assertions, or immediate retaliation, and that silence, when coupled with preparation, can speak louder than any confrontation, carry more weight than any outburst, and deliver consequences more absolute than the sharpest reproach. And I thought about the subtle, lasting impact of these actions on my family, how Mom and Sarah, through their gradual adaptation to the new reality, had learned to respect boundaries, to acknowledge effort, and to consider consequences, and how that respect, once absent, had been quietly earned through preparation rather than demanded through aggression. And I recognized the profound satisfaction that comes not from revenge or humiliation, but from the quiet, undeniable assertion of what is just, fair, and rightful. And I realized that this satisfaction was heightened by the fact that it was invisible to the casual observer, that no one could claim it was impulsive, vengeful, or emotional, because it had been the product of careful calculation, patient endurance, and unwavering attention. And as I sipped my coffee in the late afternoon light, watching the subtle shifts in their behavior, the pauses in their speech, the measured words, and the cautious acknowledgement of my authority, I understood fully that the lessons in silence and strategy are not just tactical, they are moral, psychological, and deeply instructive, teaching that underestimation carries consequences, that preparation amplifies power, and that calm observation can ultimately reshape relationships, dynamics, and perceptions in ways that are lasting and transformative. And as I reflected on the journey from years of patience, repeated dismissal, and subtle injustice to the present, where control, respect, and boundaries were restored not by force but by precision, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, the kind that is quiet, deep, and resonant, because it was built on principle rather than emotion, and I understood that the story of my household, of reclaiming authority, respect, and fairness, serves as a timeless lesson. Never confuse quiet patience for weakness, never assume that those who observe silently lack agency, and never dismiss the man who smiles politely, listens attentively, and takes notes over years, because when he finally acts, his influence, authority, and impact are absolute. And in that understanding, I found a sense of closure, clarity, and enduring empowerment, knowing that fairness, respect, and boundaries had been asserted not through confrontation, threat, or malice, but through careful, deliberate, and patient strategy, and that this quiet, methodical approach had forever reshaped how I was perceived in my family, how my actions carried weight, and how my identity as a patient, observant, and ultimately decisive individual would no longer be underestimated, ignored, or dismissed. And in that reflection, I understood fully that true strength is not loud, not flashy, and not immediate. It is quiet, patient, and strategic, and the lessons of family, justice, and respect are learned most indelibly when action, preparation, and timing converge with clarity, integrity, and inevitability, leaving no room for denial, argument, or dismissal. And as I stood in my home, looking around at the subtle signs of acknowledgement, measured behavior, and the quiet respect that had replaced entitlement and assumption, I felt the profound satisfaction of having finally, decisively, and invisibly asserted what was right, teaching a lesson that would endure far beyond the immediate moment. And that lesson was simple, yet powerful. Patience, silence, and careful strategy, when paired with courage and preparation, are the most effective tools for justice, respect, and lasting change. And the quiet man who waits, observes, and acts deliberately will always be stronger than those who rely solely on arrogance, entitlement, or assumption. And in that quiet, enduring truth, I found both closure and profound understanding, the final reflection on a journey of decades, proving that true authority and respect are earned, maintained, and restored not through shouting, anger, or manipulation, but through deliberate, patient, and unwavering action that carries consequences no one can ignore. In the days that followed the storm of that morning, the house, once filled with the casual arrogance and assumed entitlement of my sister and the moral high-handedness of my mother, began to settle into a new rhythm, one that carried an invisible but undeniable shift in authority, respect, and understanding. And I watched quietly as both Mom and Sarah adjusted, not immediately, not without frustration, but inevitably, because they could not escape the reality of what had happened, the undeniable truth that assumptions, complacency, and entitlement have limits, and that the patient, quiet observer who is underestimated for years can, with careful preparation, precise timing, and deliberate action, completely alter the landscape of control without shouting, without coercion, and without malice. And as I moved through the house, noting the subtle changes in behavior, the hesitant glances, the careful choice of words, the unspoken acknowledgement of authority in the smallest of actions, I realized that the lessons they were learning were far more profound than I had initially imagined, that the impact of being confronted with the consequences of overconfidence, manipulation, and underestimation was reshaping their understanding of family dynamics, respect, and the nature of power itself. And in their eyes, I could see the dawning comprehension that manipulation carries consequences, that reliance on unfair favoritism is fragile, and that underestimating someone because they remain quiet, polite, and patient is one of the gravest mistakes a person can make. And I took no joy in their realization in the form of mockery or gloating, because the satisfaction I felt was not born from cruelty, but from the clarity of strategy executed flawlessly, from the serene power of preparation meeting action, and from the knowledge that I had restored not just physical control over the house, accounts, keys, and utilities, but the balance of respect, recognition, and fairness that had long been missing in the household. And I noticed, with subtle but powerful satisfaction, the way Sarah now hesitated before making claims, measured her words more carefully, considered the consequences of her actions before acting, and even in small ways, began to internalize the lesson that entitlement is not permanent, that resources, privileges, and trust are earned through effort, consistency, and respect, and that the world does not bend to arrogance alone, while Mom, too, displayed subtle but profound changes, softening her condescending tone, acknowledging my decisions with less argument, offering advice rather than directives, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, beginning to understand that the quiet, patient, and observant individual she had long dismissed had long been preparing for a moment like this, a moment when justice, clarity, and authority would manifest in undeniable ways, and I reflected on my own feelings during this time, the serenity that came from knowing that years of observation, note-taking, meticulous preparation, and careful planning had culminated in a moment that shifted decades of imbalance, entitlement, and misjudgment into order, fairness, and recognition. And it was not just about the house, the accounts, or the keys. It was about establishing boundaries, demonstrating the value of patience, and revealing the subtle but profound strength of those who act deliberately rather than impulsively. And as I moved through the house, engaging in my daily routines, enjoying my morning coffee, handling correspondence, and tidying spaces that were once taken for granted, I realized that the greatest victories are often invisible, uncelebrated, and quiet, the kind that leave a lasting impact without spectacle, and that the most profound lessons are absorbed not through confrontation or conflict, but through the undeniable, lived consequences of action. And I observed Mom teaching Sarah to respect boundaries, to acknowledge effort, and to take responsibility for her actions. Subtle lessons that were reinforced by my earlier, precise intervention, and I noticed how Sarah began to approach her daily life with a mix of caution and thoughtfulness, aware now that the quiet man she once dismissed is the one who controls outcomes, not by shouting or asserting dominance, but by acting when the moment is right, prepared, and inevitable. And in the quiet of my home, I understood deeply that silence and patience are not the absence of power but its most potent form, that the underestimated individual who observes, plans, and executes at the right time wields authority far more decisively than those who rely on arrogance, entitlement, or loud words. And I reflected further on how this principle applies not just within families, but in life itself, in workplaces, friendships, and relationships, because true strength often comes from those who listen, who take note, and who act when the world least expects it. And I understood that this is a lesson many fail to learn, often at great cost, and that the quiet patience I had cultivated over decades was not weakness, compliance, or passivity, but the slow accumulation of leverage, awareness, and precision. And as I walked through each room of the house, seeing the subtle ways both Mom and Sarah had adapted to the new reality, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that my actions had not only restored control but had reshaped the dynamics in a way that promoted respect, responsibility, and fairness, and that the lessons I had imparted, though silent and unspoken, were now embedded in their awareness, creating a foundation for future interactions that would be marked by consideration rather than assumption, accountability rather than entitlement, and recognition rather than dismissal. And I realized, with a quiet, deep satisfaction, that the greatest impact comes not from being loud or aggressive, but from being observant, patient, and strategic, that the quiet man who smiles, nods, and listens is often the one who holds the most power, and that when he acts, it is with an inevitability and precision that leaves a lasting impression. And as I reflected on the long years of endurance, silent observation, and careful preparation that had led to this point, I understood that my approach had not been impulsive or vengeful, but deliberate, fair, and justified, grounded in principle rather than emotion, and that the lessons in silence, strategy, and patience were far more valuable than any immediate satisfaction, because they create lasting change, shift perceptions, and alter the course of behavior for those who assumed they were untouchable. And I could see, in the subtle deference in Sarah's speech, in Mom's softer tone, in the measured way both of them now approached me, that the quiet lessons had been absorbed, internalized, and respected. And I knew, with profound certainty, that patience, observation, and strategy are the true currencies of power, that calmness carries more weight than anger, and that silence, when paired with preparation and deliberate action, speaks louder than the loudest proclamation. And as I settled into the evening, moving quietly through the home, enjoying the serenity that follows decisive action, I reflected on the ultimate lesson I had learned and now imparted without words. Never confuse quiet patience for weakness, never underestimate the observer, and never dismiss the man who smiles politely while taking notes, because one day, when he acts, the outcome will be absolute, inevitable, and undeniable, and the echoes of that action will resonate far longer than any shout, any argument, or any temporary assertion of power. And in that deep, long-lasting understanding, I felt a profound, serene satisfaction, the kind that comes not from vengeance but from clarity, authority, and the quiet, unstoppable strength of strategic, patient action. Knowing that the balance of respect, authority, and fairness in my household had been irrevocably restored, and that the lessons in silence and strategy were now embedded permanently in both Mom and Sarah, shaping their awareness, altering their behavior, and ensuring that the underestimated quiet man would never again be ignored, dismissed, or taken for granted, and that in every small, subtle, unspoken way, my influence had quietly but completely transformed the dynamics of the home I had built, maintained, and protected, demonstrating once and for all that the power of patience, preparation, and deliberate execution is absolute, profound, and unforgettable. By late afternoon, the tension that had quietly simmered all morning reached a crescendo, transforming the house I had long maintained into a battleground of panic, disbelief, and scrambling attempts to regain control, and yet, amid the apparent chaos, I remained perfectly calm, an island of patience and quiet authority in the middle of a storm that neither Sarah nor Mom had anticipated, because I had long understood that true power does not announce itself in shouting, in frantic gestures, or in desperate attempts to control outcomes, but in meticulous preparation, strategic patience, and the unwavering execution of a plan designed over years of observation and careful calculation. And as Sarah, flustered and disoriented by the sudden loss of privileges she had always assumed as hers, attempted to gather friends, acquaintances, and distant relatives to intervene, believing that her social network could somehow apply pressure, persuade, or coerce me into reversing the changes I had put in motion, I observed quietly, taking note of every expression, every hesitating question, every ill-conceived suggestion, knowing perfectly well that none of it would succeed because the foundation of her assumed authority had been carefully dismantled in advance. And as the calls to friends and the frantic texts multiplied, Mom, in an attempt to salvage the situation and assert influence, shifted to manipulation, employing all the emotional tools she had perfected over decades, invoking nostalgia, childhood memories, family bonds, shared holidays, and the moral virtues of forgiveness, her voice quivering with a mixture of fear, frustration, and the faint hope that guilt could bend my resolve, reminding me of the sacrifices she had made, the lessons she had imparted, the idea that family means tolerating mistakes and overlooking transgressions. And yet, for all her words, for all her carefully crafted appeals to morality and emotion, I remained unshaken, nodding politely at the appropriate moments, allowing her to feel she was being heard, while inside, every word reinforced my clarity, every attempt at persuasion strengthened my certainty, because I had rehearsed this confrontation countless times in my mind, anticipating each tactic, each phrase, each attempt to undermine my authority or question my judgment, and I understood fully that their reliance on manipulation and assumption was the very tool I had prepared to expose, that their entitlement, long unchecked, and their expectation that the quiet man would never act, were now the mechanisms that ensured the absolute success of my actions. And as I watched Sarah pacing, calling friends, sending frantic messages, muttering curses under her breath about how unfair everything was, how she couldn't believe I would do this, how Mom was failing to stop me, I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that justice is unfolding without the need for confrontation, aggression, or malice, that the consequences are self-delivered by the assumptions, arrogance, and mistakes of those who underestimated me. And as Mom continued her attempts at emotional reasoning, invoking stories from my childhood, recalling moments of bonding, shared birthdays, family trips, and subtle lessons about patience and forgiveness, I listened attentively, acknowledging her concerns outwardly, yet internally, I was entirely unshaken, fully confident, because every attempt to sway me only reaffirmed what I already knew, that the quiet man, long underestimated, has the ability to act with precision and authority when the moment finally arrives, and that patience is not weakness, compliance is not consent, and observation is not passivity, but the laying of groundwork, the gathering of power, and the silent accumulation of advantage over those who assume they are in control. And by early evening, as the shadows grew long across the living room, as the last faint rays of sun filtered through the blinds, both Sarah and Mom were confronted with the undeniable truth of the situation, the stark realization that they had misjudged me for decades, that the man they assumed harmless, polite, and compliant, the one who had smiled quietly while listening to their entitlement and manipulation, was no longer merely observing, but actively executing, and the execution was flawless, meticulous, and irreversible. And as Sarah's voice faltered, her frantic pacing replaced by stunned hesitation, her earlier attempts to gather support fading into silence, I watched her struggle to comprehend the simple, undeniable fact that the privileges she had assumed as her birthright had been withdrawn through lawful, deliberate, and patient action, leaving her disoriented, frustrated, and fully aware of the consequences of underestimating me. And his mom, too, stood there, caught between the remnants of authority she once wielded and the undeniable proof of her misjudgment. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction that comes from knowing that years of careful observation, preparation, and strategic restraint had culminated in a moment of absolute clarity and power. And yet, this satisfaction was tempered not by anger or malice, but by a sense of justice, fairness, and inevitability, because I had not acted impulsively, cruelly, or vindicatively. I had simply asserted control over what was rightfully mine, exposed the patterns of entitlement and manipulation that had persisted unchecked for decades, and demonstrated, through precision and patience, the consequences of underestimation. And as the evening drew on, the house itself, once a space of assumed dominance and unchecked entitlement, now reflected the transformation in dynamic authority and awareness. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every hesitant movement a testament to the realization that the quiet, patient, and observant man, so long dismissed as powerless, was not only capable of action but had executed it flawlessly. And in that long, tense, electrifying afternoon and evening, I understood fully that power does not reside in loud proclamations, in frantic gestures, or in the assumption of entitlement, but in the deliberate, careful, and unshakable combination of patience, preparation, and decisive action. And as the shadows lengthened and the house settled into a new rhythm, marked by tension, hesitation, and the undeniable recognition of my authority, I felt the immense, profound clarity that comes from seeing assumptions crumble, witnessing entitlement falter, and observing firsthand the transformation from underestimated quiet to undeniable executor, knowing that the turning point had been reached, that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and that the man they had long assumed would never act had not only acted but had done so with precision, calm, and absolute authority. And in that moment, with Sarah silent, Mom hesitant, and the evidence of careful preparation, strategic patience, and deliberate execution all around me, I realized with perfect, serene certainty that the quiet man who smiles, who listens, who observes, and who takes notes is never powerless, that underestimation carries consequences, and that the long years of preparation, patience, and careful observation had delivered a turning point so complete, so absolute, and so undeniable that nothing in the world of entitlement, manipulation, or assumption could ever reverse it. And as I sat back, watching the subtle shifts in their expressions, hearing the faint exhalations of disbelief and reluctant comprehension, I felt a deep, intoxicating satisfaction not in vengeance but in the perfect execution of strategy, the quiet assertion of rightful authority, and the serene, absolute triumph of the patient, observant, and underestimated man finally taking his place as the orchestrator of outcomes, the controller of consequences, and the undeniable authority in a house that had long assumed he would remain silent, compliant, and powerless. And in that long, electric evening, surrounded by the quiet tremors of realization, panic, and dawning comprehension, I understood fully that the turning point was not merely a moment in time but the culmination of decades of careful observation, meticulous planning, and patient endurance, a testament to the fact that the quiet man taking notes will, when the time comes, execute with precision, control, and flawless inevitability, leaving no doubt, no room for misjudgment, and no possibility of reversing the shift in authority. And as the day faded into night, the house settled into a tense stillness, Sarah and Mom both subdued, their assumptions shattered, their sense of dominance dismantled, and I, calm and unperturbed, fully aware of the absolute success of my actions, felt the profound, resonant satisfaction of justice, inevitability, and the undeniable power of preparation, patience, and quiet, deliberate execution. Knowing that from this moment forward, nothing would be taken for granted again, that the underestimated would no longer be dismissed, and that the quiet man who had smiled politely for years, the one who had listened, observed, and taken notes, had finally and irrevocably asserted his authority in a way that was precise, flawless, and utterly undeniable. By mid-morning, the calm, quiet tension that had enveloped the house since the early hours began to fracture, first with small tremors and then with undeniable chaos, as Sarah's sense of entitlement collided violently with the reality she had never anticipated. And it started with the sharp ring of her phone, which she snatched from the couch with a panicked hand, her voice rising almost immediately as she called Mom, their tones overlapping, bouncing off the walls in waves of disbelief, frustration, and the frantic energy of people who had suddenly realized that the rules of their world had shifted without warning. And as I sat in my chair, coffee in hand, observing the scene unfold. The once ordinary living room became a theater of panic and accusation, a space where entitlement, arrogance, and assumed dominance collided with the precision of preparation and quiet authority, and I watched as Sarah paced, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her face flushed with a mix of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief, as she exclaimed, almost incoherently, "How could he do this? How could he just take everything from me? This is my home. I've been living here. I've been paying nothing, getting everything, and now he's just," her words breaking into desperate gasps, her hand flying to her forehead as though the physical gesture could help contain the panic that coursed through her, while Mom, on the other end of the line, tried to assert some semblance of authority, her voice trembling in a way that revealed more fear than control. "Be the bigger person, Sarah. Be patient. Be reasonable. Don't act out. You know this isn't permanent. He's overreacting," and yet her words, though shouted, lacked the conviction of command, the certainty of experience, and instead carried the quivering undertone of someone realizing that the carefully constructed world she had relied upon was crumbling faster than she could respond, and I could not help but feel a quiet, almost smug satisfaction, the kind that comes not from malice but from the serene certainty that years of being underestimated, dismissed, and ignored had brought me to a position where my actions, simple yet precise, were now entirely beyond the control of the people who had so often assumed they were the architects of my life. And as I sipped my coffee, listening to the rising panic, the rapid-fire words, the interrupted sentences, and the frantic pacing, I observed every detail, the flailing hands, the snapping tone, the sharp intake of breath when a missed utility notice popped up on Sarah's phone, the frustrated tapping when a payment could not be made, the redirection of blame from one to the other, and the repeated disbelief as they attempted to reason with a situation that had already been calculated with perfect foresight. And as they spoke, I realized how little they understood the nature of quiet strength, the kind of power that grows not from loud proclamations, dramatic gestures, or aggressive confrontation, but from meticulous preparation, careful observation, and the patience to wait until the moment when action is both inevitable and unstoppable. And every frantic call Sarah made to friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives only amplified her own realization that the house she had taken for granted, the utilities she had assumed were permanent, and the finances she had presumed were effortlessly accessible were now entirely beyond her reach. And yet even in the midst of this storm, she had no awareness that the calm man she had mocked, dismissed, and assumed harmless had spent years anticipating this precise sequence of events, cataloging every detail of her behavior, memorizing every routine, and quietly laying the groundwork to ensure that when the time came, the consequences would be unavoidable, perfectly timed, and inescapably clear. And I watched her voice rise higher, the words now spilling faster. "Mom. He can't do this. This is my house. He can't. Why are you letting him do this?" While Mom, attempting to mediate, now sounded almost panicked herself, her voice quivering, "Sarah, calm down. He's trying to teach you responsibility. You need to be reasonable. Think about what he's saying." But the words rang hollow, the tone failing to carry the authority she had relied upon for so long, because the foundation of her perceived control had been quietly removed by careful preparation, and the realization of this, though subtle, was beginning to dawn on her as well, as her calm authority collapsed under the weight of consequences she had never anticipated. And I, sitting back, did nothing more than observe, the thrill of quiet control coursing through me, because the lesson was being delivered perfectly, directly, without a single word from me, without a shout, without anger, without threat, only the natural result of preparation meeting inevitability. And each notification that appeared on my own phone, each frantic text from Sarah asking what she could do, each escalating call from Mom pleading for patience and reason, reinforced the truth I had known for decades, that the underestimated, quiet, and patient man, who others assume will never act, holds a power far greater than those who rely on entitlement, loud words, or temporary alliances. And as Sarah moved through the house in a frantic attempt to reclaim control, flinging objects aside in a desperate bid for momentum, muttering curses and accusations under her breath, calling Mom repeatedly, and scanning every possible avenue to reverse what she had assumed was her natural authority, I felt the weight of years of silent observation, patience, and meticulous preparation settle over me in a way that was profoundly satisfying, because the chaos around me was entirely a product of their own assumptions, their own miscalculations, and their own complacency, and in that, There was no cruelty in my actions, only justice, inevitability, and the quiet, undeniable power of preparedness. And as I watched Mom pace nervously, trying to negotiate, cajole, and reason, but realizing that her influence was suddenly insufficient, that the carefully cultivated habits of indulgence she had encouraged in Sarah were now the very mechanisms of her own frustration, I understood fully that the quiet man, long dismissed, does not need to raise his voice, does not need to assert himself through confrontation, because the consequences of careful, deliberate, and calculated action speak louder than any lecture, shout, or argument ever could. And each step of this unfolding chaos, each frantic call, each rising tone, each flurry of messages, was the validation of every year I had spent taking note, observing behavior, cataloging weaknesses, and quietly building a position of control that was absolute. And as the minutes ticked by, with Sarah now realizing that no amount of shouting, pleading, or argument could reclaim the privileges she had assumed were permanent, and Mom grappling with the sudden exposure of how fragile her authority had become, I sipped my coffee again, calmly, as if nothing unusual were happening, and allowed the wave of realization, frustration, and disbelief to wash over them completely, unimpeded, unmoderated, and entirely as a result of their own assumptions. And the satisfaction I felt in that moment was not born of malice, not of cruelty, but of a deep, resonant awareness that patience, observation, and preparation, when applied with precision and timing, are far more powerful than anger, confrontation, or entitlement. And as the chaos in the house escalated, the voices rising and overlapping, the missed payments notifications piling up, the panic on their faces and in their gestures, the frantic calls and unheeded advice, I felt the long years of quiet endurance, of meticulous note-taking, and of being underestimated coalesce into a single, undeniable truth, that the quiet man, the patient observer, the one assumed powerless, when finally acting decisively, becomes an unstoppable force, a living demonstration that assumptions of weakness carry a cost, that underestimated patience is a weapon, and that strategy, preparation, and timing will always trump loud words, entitlement, or complacency. And as I sat there, coffee in hand, watching their carefully constructed world of comfort, entitlement, and assumed control unravel in real time, I realized the profound satisfaction of absolute, unchallenged authority achieved without confrontation, without malice, simply through the invisible, inevitable, and undeniable weight of careful, patient, and deliberate action. And in that quiet observation, I understood the full meaning of control, power, and justice, knowing that the quiet man who takes notes and waits patiently for the right moment is the one who can shift the world around him entirely with nothing more than calm precision. And as Sarah and Mom floundered helplessly amidst the chaos of consequences they had never foreseen, their voices rising and falling, their panic escalating, their sense of invulnerability shattered, I felt the serene, intoxicating satisfaction of the underestimated finally taking his place at the center of authority, orchestrating, silently and completely, the unraveling of entitlement, arrogance, and ignorance. And I knew with perfect clarity that this was just the beginning, that the quiet, patient, and meticulously prepared man had finally made the impossible inevitable, the underestimated undeniable, and the long-ignored authority absolute. It started early one Monday morning, the kind of morning that feels ordinary at first glance, with sunlight creeping lazily through the blinds, a slight chill in the air that hinted at change without announcing it, and the comforting aroma of coffee brewing. Yet beneath that veneer of normalcy, the atmosphere of the house had begun to shift imperceptibly, almost imperceptibly, as though the walls themselves sensed the calm before the inevitable upheaval. And I, walking through the familiar rooms, moving quietly and deliberately, took a slow, measured breath, savoring the moment with a strange, controlled anticipation, knowing that today would be different, that the balance of power, long skewed in favor of entitlement and favoritism, would finally tilt toward fairness and authority. And as I moved through the living room, I saw Sarah sprawled lazily on the couch, her phone in hand, her thumbs dancing across the screen as she scrolled through social media, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon the life she had long assumed belonged to her by default. Her laughter faintly echoing through the rooms as she read comments from friends, her sense of invulnerability evident in the careless way she tossed pillows aside, kicked her shoes off without thought, and murmured to herself about how the house, the comforts, and the appliances were hers for the taking, hers to enjoy without consideration, effort, or responsibility. And I smiled quietly, almost imperceptibly, noting the casual arrogance that had driven me to this point, the sense of entitlement that had festered in the house for decades, the complacency that had allowed her to assume that my silence was submission and my patience was weakness. And yet here I stood, the quiet man who had spent years observing, cataloging, and calculating, the one she had always underestimated, the one who had quietly accumulated control while appearing harmless, and in that moment, I understood the beauty of preparation, the potency of patience, and the quiet thrill of knowing that my time had finally arrived, and with deliberate calm, I reached for the set of keys that had always belonged to me, keys that represented authority, security, and the culmination of years of effort, the tangible embodiment of control that had been ignored or assumed as trivial by everyone else, and I turned them in my hand thoughtfully before walking to the first lock, sliding it open with a smooth, unhurried motion, the sound of the mechanism clicking into place echoing faintly through the still morning, and I did this for every entry point, moving methodically through the house as if performing a ritual, shutting out the complacency that had allowed entitlement to flourish for too long, asserting in every motion, without words, without confrontation, that this was my home, that the foundation, the walls, the floors, and the very atmosphere of the house were the product of decades of labor, sacrifice, and careful management, and no one had the right to assume ownership without respect, recognition, or accountability, and having completed that symbolic yet practical act, I turned my attention to the utilities, contacting providers calmly, verifying account details, and activating temporary holds that would render the previously taken for granted services suddenly absent, their absence subtle at first but unavoidable, the faucets, the lights, the climate control, the internet, and the television, all silent yet potent reminders that entitlement has limits, that access is a privilege, and that assumptions of permanence are easily shattered when preparation meets execution. And after ensuring that every logistical detail was in place, I drafted the final piece, the single, precise email to the bank, composed with a calm, measured tone that carried no anger, no accusation, no boast, only clear, legal assertion of control over the accounts, outlining the changes I had authorized, every phrase deliberate, every word chosen to convey authority and clarity without excess, the kind of communication that leaves no room for negotiation, ambiguity, or misunderstanding. And after sending that email, I leaned back for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, aware that the world as they knew it was about to change, and within moments, the consequences began to unfold. My phone, which had sat silently beside me, suddenly erupted in a cacophony of rings, notifications, and vibrations, and I watched calmly as messages poured in one after another, texts flooding in from Sarah and Mom in waves of panic, disbelief, and desperate attempts to regain control, their tones swinging from anger to pleading to incredulity in rapid succession, each message a testament to the underestimation that had defined my relationship with them for decades, and I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, the kind that comes from knowing that preparation, patience, and observation have created a situation that no amount of charm, manipulation, or entitlement can overcome, and as the calls continued, I observed their frantic attempts to communicate, the rise and fall of their emotions in the texts and voicemails, the subtle shift in their assumed dominance as the reality of my decisive action settled over them, and I realized in that moment that for years, I had been the quiet observer, cataloging their behaviors, noting the inequities, tolerating the dismissals, and internalizing the slight, not out of weakness but out of strategy, and now, as the quiet executor, I was the one defining the reality, the rules, and the boundaries, and the thrill of this realization, not born of malice but of clarity and control, was intoxicating in a way I had never known, because finally, the assumptions they had made about me, the belief that patience equals submission, that silence equals acceptance, that the quiet man will never act, were being shattered in real time, and each frustrated, incredulous, or panicked communication was proof of the power that comes from careful, deliberate action, from knowing precisely when and how to intervene after years of preparation, from having quietly amassed the tools, knowledge, and authority necessary to shift the balance decisively in one clear moment. And as I moved through the house, observing the subtle signs of rising panic, the frantic pacing, the missed calls, the unanswered texts piling up on their devices, the whispers and muttered conversations between Sarah and Mom as they attempted to interpret, challenge, or counter the sudden assertion of control, I felt a profound, almost serene satisfaction, knowing that the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had not been in vain, that every moment of patience, every quiet observation, every calculated decision had prepared me for this day, the day when the quiet, underestimated man would demonstrate the power of preparation, precision, and timing, and the realization that underestimation has a price settled over me like a calm, undeniable force, a weightless but absolute truth that the quiet, patient, observant man always has the advantage when the moment to act finally arrives. And as I sipped my coffee, looking at the phone still buzzing relentlessly beside me, watching the subtle panic, disbelief, and growing urgency reflected in every message, I felt not anger, not vindictiveness, but a deep, resonant satisfaction that control, rightful authority, and the validation of years of hard work and careful observation had finally manifested in a way that could not be ignored, reversed, or diminished. And in that quiet, deliberate, and calculated moment, I understood fully that patience, preparation, and the willingness to act decisively when the time is right are the most powerful tools a person can have, because they transform the underestimated into the unassailable, the quiet into the commanding, and the long-suppressed authority into an undeniable force. And as the morning light stretched across the rooms, highlighting every corner of the home I had built and preserved while being dismissed, while Sarah's sense of entitlement collided violently with the reality of action, and while Mom's lectures on morality and gratitude faltered under the weight of undeniable consequence, I felt a profound clarity, an absolute certainty that the quiet man taking notes, preparing meticulously, and waiting patiently for the right moment can, in a single, decisive act, transform years of inequity, favoritism, and underestimation into a carefully orchestrated, undeniable assertion of control, justice, and recognition. And in that long, electric morning, surrounded by the subtle chaos of missed calls, urgent texts, and panicked whispers, I understood with absolute precision that patience is never weakness, silence is never surrender, and the underestimated quiet man, when he finally acts, does so with a force that cannot be ignored, altered, or resisted. And as I looked around the house, the subtle tremor of inevitability coursing through every corner, I felt the calm, measured, intoxicating satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly, a lesson taught definitively, and the quiet, patient, observant man finally, irrevocably in command. And with that realization, I knew that the day of reckoning, long anticipated, had not only begun but had already claimed its victory, and that nothing in the house, in the assumptions of entitlement, or in the misplaced complacency of those who had underestimated me for decades could reverse what had been quietly, meticulously, and decisively set into motion. Over the next several days, I moved with a deliberate, almost surgical precision, each step measured and intentional, as though every small action were a note in a symphony that only I could hear and orchestrate. And in the quiet of my home, I became both conductor and instrument, ensuring that nothing was left to chance, that every variable, every potential misstep, every opportunity for disruption or resistance was accounted for and neutralized in advance, because I had learned over decades of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed that true power lies not in impulse or emotion but in preparation, observation, and the careful, calculated execution of small, precise actions that together form an unstoppable force. And so I began the week by contacting the bank, calmly, politely, ensuring that every account that required my authorization, every transaction that could be made, every small lever of control, would pass only through me, solidifying my access and authority while my sister remained blissfully unaware, her mind occupied with the trivialities of her day, the casual indulgence of her routines, the certainty that the house, the resources, and the attention of our mother were hers by default, as though the years of my labor, the painstaking effort, and the meticulous planning that had gone into securing every aspect of our shared home were irrelevant. And I moved next to the utility companies, dialing each number with a calm, deliberate tone, verifying account details, confirming that only I could authorize changes, and establishing temporary holds that could be activated at precisely the right moment, while simultaneously changing passwords, updating security questions, ensuring that nothing could be altered or overridden without my explicit consent, and documenting every key, every spare, every access point, knowing that these small but critical details, often ignored or assumed by those around me, would form the pillars of a plan that was invisible to anyone who believed my calm demeanor was compliance. And as I worked through each task, I secured the legal documents that had long been carelessly left out in plain sight, contracts, deeds, insurance papers, and other sensitive information that had been treated as casual clutter by my sister and, to a degree, by my mother. And I filed, cataloged, and encrypted each piece with meticulous care, fully aware that each one would become a powerful tool of leverage at the right time. And all the while, Sarah carried on with her casual obliviousness, talking to friends on the phone, bragging about how the house was hers, laughing as she recounted her plans for the weekend, planning dinner parties, shopping sprees, and vacations, never once pausing to consider the man who had worked tirelessly to secure this home, the man who had silently tolerated years of entitlement and manipulation, or the reality that every comfort she enjoyed had been earned, maintained, and protected by someone who had long ago learned to hide his true capabilities behind a polite, quiet exterior, while Mom continued her usual repertoire, delivering her lectures on gratitude, responsibility, and the virtue of being the bigger person with her signature condescending tone, as if repeating the mantra enough times could erase the inequities that had been allowed to fester for decades, as if invoking moral high ground in a vacuum could replace fairness and accountability, and throughout it all, I maintained the perfect mask of calm, smiling when appropriate, nodding in acknowledgement, allowing their sense of security to grow even as I carefully catalogued every misstep, every casual entitlement, every phrase and tone that betrayed their assumption that I was harmless, impotent, or incapable of decisive action, because I had learned that patience, once scorned, is the most formidable weapon of all, that quiet observation allows for precision, that calmness conceals power, and that the thrill of control is far more intoxicating than the surge of immediate anger. As I methodically moved from task to task, checking off lists I had written weeks, months, even years earlier, ensuring that no detail was overlooked, that no loophole existed, and that when the moment finally arrived, my plan would unfold flawlessly, unstoppable in its simplicity and effectiveness. And in the midst of this preparation, I took a moment to reflect on the years of endurance that had brought me here, the countless occasions where I had swallowed my pride, smiled politely, and allowed insults, inequities, and dismissals to pass, storing them all carefully, learning not out of spite but out of necessity, building a mental archive of behaviors, words, and assumptions, and realizing now that every unnoticed slight, every perceived weakness, every underestimated capability had contributed to the creation of an advantage that no one around me could have imagined. And as I moved through the house, straightening a cushion here, moving a stack of papers there, checking off each meticulously planned step, I felt a calm thrill that was not born of malice but of inevitability, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the man they had long assumed would remain passive, polite, and powerless was now several steps ahead, that the moment when the seemingly harmless observer would reveal his full capacity was approaching, and that the preparation, patience, and strategy that had been dismissed as meekness would soon manifest as undeniable, unavoidable control. And in the quiet of my own home, surrounded by the chaos they had always assumed I would silently accept, I felt an intoxicating sense of clarity, an unshakable understanding that the culmination of all these actions, all these careful measures, all these years of silent observation, would not only assert my authority over what was rightfully mine but would also reveal, in the most subtle yet devastating way, the consequences of underestimating the quiet man, the one who smiles politely while taking notes, the one who tolerates entitlement while mentally mapping every detail, the one who appears harmless but has long been preparing a response both measured and unyielding. And as the days unfolded, I moved seamlessly through my plan, contacting, verifying, documenting, securing, and observing, each task bringing me closer to the moment when the abstract idea of justice would crystallize into undeniable reality, the moment when patience and precision would speak louder than anger, louder than entitlement, louder than favoritism, when the quiet, underestimated man would assert control not through confrontation but through flawless execution. And the satisfaction of this knowledge was profound, a slow, intoxicating undercurrent that ran through every cell in my body, reinforcing the power of careful preparation, the necessity of calm calculation, and the truth that those who are overlooked are often the ones quietly accumulating the tools, knowledge, and authority necessary to completely shift the balance of power when the moment is right. And so I continued through the week, task by task, note by note, call by call, password by password, never once breaking my composed exterior, never hinting, never threatening, never allowing a single glance, comment, or movement to betray the fact that the man they assumed would never act had not only acted in his mind for years but was now ready to act in reality. And as I finished the final steps of documentation, verified the last account, confirmed the final utility hold, and secured the final key, I sat back for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle, the perfect calm of a storm yet to come, a serene satisfaction unlike any emotion I had known before, because I understood that control is not in force or shouting, that justice is not in drama or spectacle, and that the true thrill, the true satisfaction, comes from knowing that the quiet, patient, careful man, long underestimated, had meticulously prepared every detail, considered every scenario, and now, poised on the edge of execution, could allow the first ripple of action to spread like fire, unstoppable, unanticipated, and completely deserved. And in that perfect, silent, electric calm, I realized with profound clarity that patience, strategy, and observation had been my true allies all along, and that the storm about to unfold was not chaos but inevitability, not vengeance but rightful restoration, and that the thrill of the coming moment, not in anger but in precise, undeniable control, was far more satisfying than any outburst of emotion, because finally, the man who had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed was fully ready to demonstrate, with deliberate, unstoppable clarity, the power of preparation, patience, and quiet, calculated resolve. And I smiled quietly, fully aware that the calm before the storm was not only intoxicating but also absolute, that the silent, underestimated man had all the pieces in place, and that the world of entitlement, favoritism, and assumed innocence had no idea what was coming, and that when the first move was finally executed, the inevitability of justice, measured, precise, and perfectly timed, would finally, irrevocably, and undeniably prove that the quiet observer is always, in the end, the one with the ultimate control.
It was an ordinary Wednesday morning, the kind of morning that arrives with no ceremony, no fanfare, no indication that anything significant is about to happen, just the quiet ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft glint of sunlight bouncing off the windows onto the familiar surfaces of a house I had painstakingly built and maintained for years, yet the air carried the subtle, suffocating weight of routine, of monotony, of things left undone, of silent resentments. Simmering beneath polite conversation, and as I walked through the rooms, noting the scattered coffee cups on the counter, the plates with dried remnants of meals left half-finished, the laundry crumpled on chairs or spilling onto the floors in a careless heap that had become all too common, and the casual entitlement lingering in the messages Sarah had left on the kitchen table, on sticky notes, on scraps of paper, the kind of entitlement that assumed ownership without acknowledgement, assumed indulgence without gratitude, assumed the house itself was her right rather than my painstaking achievement. A wave of irritation crept into my chest, a slow-burning ember that had lain dormant, smoldering quietly beneath years of cultivated patience, beneath decades of swallowing my pride to avoid confrontation, beneath the careful, polite facade I had learned to present to my family as a shield against scorn and dismissiveness. And as I moved through the kitchen, picking up the notes, glancing at the messages demanding small conveniences and favors without a single word of thanks, reading Sarah's casual assumption that she could live here rent-free indefinitely, I couldn't help but reflect on the countless moments over the years when I had been told to be the bigger person, to let things slide, to forgive, to overlook, as though my patience was proof of my moral superiority, when in reality it had been exploited, dismissed, and interpreted as weakness. And in that reflection, my mind began to sharpen, focusing not on the irritation itself but on the pattern, on the years of inequity, on the way that kindness and responsibility had been taken for granted. And that day, in that quiet kitchen, something shifted, a clarity piercing the usual fog of routine, a realization that this insistence on being the bigger person had been a trap all along, a subtle, invisible cage built out of good intentions and familial guilt, a structure designed to keep me compliant, deferential, and underestimated. And as that clarity settled over me, the simmering ember of irritation ignited into a steady, deliberate flame, not of rage, not of impulsive anger, but of focus, of strategic intent, of precise awareness that finally the moment had come to act not out of emotion but out of preparation. And I understood, with a calm so absolute it felt almost surreal, that in a world where those around you exploit kindness, patience is misread as weakness, silence as acceptance, and the polite, quiet person as harmless. The real power is in surprise, in deliberate, calculated action, in the ability to move decisively when no one is watching or expecting. And so I started the day with small but deliberate acts, picking up my phone, opening notebooks, reviewing documents that I had carefully archived over the years, every bank statement meticulously filed, every insurance policy, every legal document, every correspondence saved and catalogued, knowing that these seemingly mundane records, these mundane bureaucratic details, were in reality the instruments of control, the backbone of a plan that had been incubating in my mind silently for decades, patiently, methodically, because I had learned that preparation is the true measure of power, and the careful, methodical man is always steps ahead of those who act on impulse or entitlement. And as I went through my list, writing down every account, verifying every utility, noting the expiration dates, the keyholder permissions, the points of leverage, the minor inconveniences that could be activated to assert authority over the home, over what was mine, a strange serenity washed over me, because for the first time in decades, I was not reacting to their manipulation or favoritism, I was acting on my own terms, in my own time, and with a precision that made the chaos they had taken for granted inevitable. I paused in the living room, looking at the sofa where Sarah had slept the night before. The faint indentation of her careless presence, the remote thrown carelessly onto the floor, the magazines scattered across the table in a casual mess, and I thought about all the times I had endured her carelessness, her audacity, her assumption that the house itself and the efforts of my life were merely props for her comfort, and I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that endurance without action is invisible, and that the quiet man who observes is only as powerful as the moment he chooses to intervene. And now, that moment was imminent. I moved to the office, opened the drawers where I had kept years of correspondence, legal notices, contracts, and statements, flipping carefully through them, mentally rehearsing every possible scenario, anticipating how Mom would respond, how Sarah would react, how the messages would flood in, how the phone calls would escalate, and I did all this without a single tremor in my hands, without a hint of the storm I was preparing, because I knew that calmness is the perfect disguise for impending action, that serenity can hide decades of observation and preparation, that a quiet mind can orchestrate chaos without ever raising its voice. And as I sat at the desk, making lists of accounts to contact, utilities to freeze, passwords to change, and documents to leverage, I felt a strange thrill, the kind that comes not from anger but from clarity, the rare satisfaction of knowing that you are about to act in alignment with both morality and strategy, of finally asserting yourself against a lifetime of inequity, of finally reclaiming control over what you have earned while exposing the entitlement and favoritism that had been normalized for too long. And as I considered the timing, the sequence of actions, the way each small step would compound into an overwhelming assertion of authority, I realized that my plan did not require confrontation, shouting, or dramatics, because the brilliance of it lay in its invisibility, in the suddenness, in the fact that those who had underestimated me would never anticipate a single move until it was already complete, and that is the essence of true power, to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to appear harmless, all while silently preparing a chain of actions that, once triggered, cannot be ignored, cannot be undone, and cannot be misinterpreted as anything other than decisive, rightful authority. And in that quiet, deliberate morning, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I had built while being ignored, dismissed, and undervalued, I felt a profound sense of purpose, a deep, unshakable clarity that the day's actions, executed with precision, patience, and calm, would finally demonstrate that being the bigger person is not about submission or moral superiority but about knowing when to observe, when to prepare, and when to act. And with that understanding, I moved through the house, one deliberate step at a time, making mental notes of the triggers, the leverage points, the tiny details that had been ignored for so long, understanding that these small details, when combined with the years of observation, would form the foundation of a response so comprehensive, so unexpected, and so effective that no amount of charm, manipulation, or favoritism could counter it. And I smiled quietly, knowing that the storm I had been preparing silently for decades was finally approaching, that the underestimated, quiet man who had been dismissed for his calm demeanor and patience was about to demonstrate the force of meticulous, intelligent, patient action, and that in the end, justice would not arrive as a shout, a confrontation, or a dramatic spectacle, but as the seamless, quiet, unstoppable execution of a plan born from years of observation, note-taking, and strategic thought. And as I sipped my coffee, looking out the window at the familiar view of my driveway, my mind calmly reviewing each step, each timing, each possible reaction, I realized that nothing could stop what was about to unfold, because the quiet man who takes notes is never powerless, and the underestimated, the patient, the observant, and the careful are always capable of changing everything when they decide that the moment to act has finally arrived.
Growing up, my sister Sarah and I were nothing alike, almost like we had been molded from entirely different molds of personality and temperament, and that contrast, which might have made for a simple sibling story elsewhere, instead became the foundation for a lifetime of imbalance, unfair comparisons, and quiet frustration, because while she moved through life with an effortless charm that could soften even my mother's sternest expressions into indulgent smiles, while she could twist situations with a casual word or a flutter of her eyes to get what she wanted and often did so without thought or consequence, I was the opposite in every way, grounded, methodical, practical, and quiet to the point that most people assumed my silence meant submission or weakness. Yet in truth, I had learned early to value observation and reflection over impulsive reaction, to measure consequences over immediate gratification, and to build my life through hard work, late nights, early mornings, and a careful, almost painstaking attention to detail that manifested in every decision I made, every dollar I saved, every plan I executed to secure stability, and from the moment I was old enough to understand fairness, or rather, the lack of it, in my household, I realized that effort was rarely measured for what it truly was. It was measured by attention, affection, and performative approval, and those metrics were almost always skewed in favor of Sarah, who, no matter how careless, lazy, or self-indulgent she could be, always found a way to emerge unscathed, adored, and celebrated, while I, who labored quietly, consistently, and responsibly, was scrutinized, corrected, or gently rebuked for the smallest slip, the tiniest oversight, or the slightest hint of independence that deviated from my mother's rigid expectations of compliance and obedience, and it hurt in ways that were subtle, lingering, and cumulative, not the kind of sharp pang that fades quickly, but the sort that embeds itself into your perception of family, love, and belonging, because you start to see patterns, the repeated cycles of favoritism, the endless rotations of intervention and indulgence for the one sibling, and the quiet correction and judgment for the other, and though it bruised my pride and tested my patience, over time, I learned not to fight pointless battles, not to waste energy challenging what I could not immediately change, not to argue when the rules seemed invisible or applied inconsistently, but instead to watch, to note, and to store each moment in the quiet recesses of my mind, like a ledger of behaviors, words, and glances that, while harmless to them in their daily execution, were forming a blueprint in me for understanding, strategy, and eventual control, because I began to realize that life rewards the careful observer, that quiet men are underestimated for a reason, and that patience, when paired with knowledge, can become an invisible power that others never see coming. And so I watched my sister move through the house as though it were hers, leaving dishes scattered, laundry undone, deadlines ignored, money borrowed or wasted without thought, while my mother swooped in, rescuing her from the consequences of her own choices with a nurturing that felt less like love and more like enabling, and I absorbed it all, understanding the dynamics, noting the moments when Sarah's charm would deflect criticism, when Mom's indulgence would shield her from responsibility, and when I, despite being the responsible, hard-working, dependable child, was cast as ungrateful or difficult simply for asking a simple question, pointing out an inconsistency, or expecting fairness, and it hurt, yes, deeply, but it also taught me something invaluable. In a household ruled by favoritism and selective affection, knowledge and observation become more powerful than anger, and patience more formidable than shouting, because when everyone assumes you are harmless, silent, and pliable, you have the unique advantage of time to understand, anticipate, and prepare, and so I built my life quietly, brick by brick, not just in my career, but in the very home I purchased with years of labor, with sacrifices that spanned decades, with the knowledge that this house represented more than shelter. It was a testament to my independence, responsibility, and perseverance, the tangible proof that I could create, maintain, and protect what I had earned even in an environment where familial validation often felt arbitrary and misallocated, and when Sarah, at some point in her mid-30s, decided to move back in, rent-free, without hesitation, without effort, without consideration, I felt a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and quiet rage that was tempered only by my understanding that reaction without planning would achieve nothing, that confrontation without control would only give them what they desired, the drama, the spectacle, the satisfaction of seeing me flustered, and I watched her stride through the rooms, tossing belongings carelessly, demanding conveniences, assuming permissions, smiling at Mom as though their silent alliance was a shield against any sense of fairness or consequence, while I stood back, quietly taking note of every word, every glance, every casual entitlement, storing them in the mental ledger I had been compiling for decades, realizing that this behavior was not just disrespectful, it was predictable, and predictability, when understood and anticipated, is a tool far more powerful than impulsive anger, and when I finally spoke, carefully, deliberately, pointing out that the financial strain, the obligations of property maintenance, and the respect owed for what had been painstakingly earned were being overlooked, my mother dismissed me with that same condescending smile she had perfected over the years, the one that conveyed moral authority while simultaneously undermining any sense of equality. And she repeated, almost mechanically, "Be the bigger person," as if by speaking the phrase she could erase the years of oversight, favoritism, and inequity, as if my patient, responsible, and quiet demeanor was a flaw rather than a strength, and I nodded, smiled politely, and said nothing. Because I had long since understood that the power in these situations does not lie in immediate confrontation but in quiet observation, in preparation, and in the ability to act decisively when the time is right. And that day, standing in my own home, seeing my sister take liberties with a sense of entitlement she had cultivated since childhood and seeing my mother reinforce it, I felt an unfamiliar clarity. Patience is not weakness, quiet is not submission, and every slight, every dismissive word, every unfair comparison is not wasted if you take note, if you watch, if you store it away, because life eventually gives the quiet, observant, and patient the chance to turn the tide, to assert control, and to demand respect in ways that no one else sees coming. And in that moment, as I looked at Sarah laughing at some private joke, Mom patting her on the back, and the home I had built being treated as though it was hers by default, I realized that the culmination of all those years of careful work, careful watching, and careful note-taking was about to reach a point where it would no longer be about endurance but about action, and that understanding brought a quiet but potent satisfaction that was entirely different from anger. It was the knowledge that the underestimated, the ignored, the quiet one, is often the one who is preparing the storm that no one sees coming. And as the sunlight filtered through the windows onto the floors I had polished, the countertops I had maintained, and the walls I had strengthened through care, I knew that my time to act, to reclaim control, and to assert what was rightfully mine was approaching, because living in the shadow of favoritism, as I had for decades, does not just build resentment, it builds insight, it builds strategy, it builds a quiet strength that, when unleashed, is impossible to ignore. And in that understanding, I found both the patience to wait and the clarity to know exactly how, when, and why I would act, ensuring that the lesson of respect, fairness, and acknowledgement would finally, definitively, be taught, not through anger or confrontation, but through precision, strategy, and the quiet force of a man who had been underestimated for far too long and had spent his life learning how to turn observation into authority, endurance into power, and silence into a decisive, undeniable impact that would finally make those who had ignored him take notice, respect, and, most importantly, understand that the quiet one who takes notes is never powerless, only waiting for the moment when patience becomes action, observation becomes strategy, and the underestimated man becomes unstoppable.